Happy Saturday to everyone. Zoom was very cranky this morning and took a full 2 minutes to let me open the meeting and then an entire minute to let me go to live to YouTube. So if people are coming in late, I'm wondering if Zoom is just having a little cranky day off. Seem to have smoothed out now though, so hopefully we won't have any other issues. All right, as people trickle in, feel free to let your questions rip.
Hi, Max. This is Dominique. For the second assignment, the one I think either on Thursday, did you want us to do a wireframe for that one too, or is that the one that the wireframe was for the one before it? I was just a little confused because I'm gonna add I sent you a couple of screenshots of what I had. I'm gonna play around with it again today, but I'm also gonna add some. I already have React on my website or my capstone. I'm just gonna add some more because I do want to do the pages in it. So I'm just gonna send you that too. But I didn't know if that was gonna be like too much work to send to you or.
Nope. Whatever you send, I'm happy to give feedback on. The first one is the wireframes for the appliance case. So those should be specific to the appliance case. The second assignment, I think it's 58, is just getting the full stack working with SQLize in any project. So you can do it in the appliance case, but if you're already doing that in your capstone, you can just turn in your capstone code, and I can give you feedback on that as well. So the second assignment is definitely more flexible and you can do in your capstone, but you do not need to wireframe that app.
Okay, thank you. If I do it with my capstone, should I go through it with Postgres and Beehive? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, if you go through those steps, even if your capstone is not oriented to having a database, I'm happy to talk about a couple ways that you could incorporate a database into your project. And the only reason that I push on that is because employers really want to see some full stack project, especially if they're hiring you as a full stack developer. So even if it doesn't make a ton of sense where you're like, well, this is just content in my page, why does that need to be in a database? We can find some way to kind of transform the project to get that data flowing through a full stack, just so you have a little bit more exposure for your portfolio.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep. Other questions?
Max, I have a question about the, so we used the diagram markup and ERDs. So if you, I'm a little bit confused about the three. So if you were to choose between one for a project, let's say because of time and also maybe the requirement, so which one would you use? And also if you were to use all the three, the order.
Yep, absolutely. So I would say out of data flow diagrams, an ERD, a wireframe, or a mockup, I would do the mockup as the top priority, because the reasoning behind that is that's probably the thing closest to the client, or what we would consider a deliverable, something that we can actually hand off to the client and say, here, do you like this? Do you want any modifications? The other reason behind that is because you kind of have to think through the other three. You've got to think through the data flow diagram. You've got to think through your database structure in the ERD. And you have to think through wireframing or how you're going to lay out your app. And all of that kind of starts to manifest in the mockup, right? The mockup's really the first tangible thing that you can look at and say, all right, I understand how this app is going to flow. I understand what it's going to look like. I can make sure all the features are in there, all of that kind of stuff. So the mockup to me is most important, but that doesn't mean that the ERD or any of the others aren't important. It just means that you kind of need to do all of those before the mockup, even if you're not officially doing them, right? Like you still need to plan them out. So if you're just jotting down columns and writing a table name on top of it, you don't need to go full blown ERD, right? You don't need to think about maybe all the one-to-many relations or all of that stuff, but you still need to plan out your database if you're skipping the final kind of formal ERD step, which is definitely something that I do frequently, right? I'm like, I know what I'm adding a single table here. I know what that table relates to. I'm not going to go open my ERD, add in the new table, draw all the lines. It's like, I just want to drop a quick table in here. Now, the downside to that is when a new team member comes in and I go, well, it's all in the models. They're like, right, but I need to visualize it. Like, I need to understand what's the core here. How does this relate? You know, what's the hierarchy of the tables? And I'm like, yeah, having a visual of the ERD would certainly be nice there. So there are definitely consequences for skipping those steps. In terms of order, it really depends on the project. I'm assuming that this is a full stack web project. I'm assuming there's a database involved. I'm assuming it's for a client. So my general order would be requirements collection from the business user. If we were doing all of these steps, I would personally do requirements from the user first, get them to sign off on that and say, yes, everything that I want this app to do is done in this list. You covered it all. Then I would take that list and kind of start breaking it up into screens and start to figure out, okay, what needs to show up. From there, I would probably do I would probably skip the data flow diagram because that's kind of part of figuring out what screens you need. And I would jump right into the ERD because the ERD is going to force you into thinking about structure and force you into thinking about every little piece of data that application needs to track. From there, I would go on to my wireframes. And if you are looking to save time, you could go right into your mockups. Designers would be screaming bloody murder that you want to do your wireframe separately from your mockups. And there is definitely value in separating them out. As demonstrated in class, we kind of cheated a little bit and we did our hybrid wireframe mockup, which is fine to do because clearly it's working out fine for us. But the mockup is going to be closer to Bootstrap or whatever design framework you're using. The wireframes are literally just let's get the layout onto the page and figure out what needs to be on the page without thinking about the design of those elements. Then we would move into mockups if we had the time on that project. I like doing a page by page build out when we get to code. So I like doing my project setup for both front end and back end, getting that out of the way, getting body parser working, cores, get my SQLi set up, all of that stuff. Then I like to build out my front end with dummy data, then go to my back end and build out the models, then build out the endpoints, and then use those endpoints in my front end to get the data actually showing up on the front end and doing all the CRUD operations. At that point, it is then just a rinse and repeat. All right, let's move on to my next page. Let me do the front end there. Let me go do the models. Let me make the endpoints. Let me go back to the front end and use those endpoints and move on to the next one. So that's how I would personally do it. That is not how it always happens, and that is not how it may always happen in the work world, right? The work world, the ERD may be done for you by the database team, and the endpoints may already be created for you by your backend team. And as a front end dev, you're just handed all of that documentation, and they say go, and you're like, okay, well, that ticks off a lot of boxes at the end, but I still need to wireframe this and do mockups and actually understand what this is going to look like before I dive into the code. Sometimes you're even handed that as a front end developer, and they go, you're a front end developer, not a front end designer. Let's be honest, most engineers are not good designers. So we have a art person who knows nothing about code, but understands design and layout. So we're going to do all your mockups for you, hand it to you, and you just have to code it out. So it is a very long-winded answer of saying it all depends on how your company is organized, what your job expectations are. If your boss understands that each of those steps are independent steps, or if they're just like, we don't care, just get it all done, and you have to go through that whole process, which definitely happens, right? There are times that you're on a team where they go, we don't care if you cut corners if the end product is right. But the cost of those cutting corners is that if you jump to code too soon, now you need to rearrange all of your code, which is 10 times harder to do in code land than it is to do in mockup land, where you literally are just dragging things around. So definitely consequences or side effects for skipping steps. Less consequences if you do the steps out of order. If you really say like, look, my brain works a certain way, I need to do all of my React code and get all of the front end done, every single screen of it, and then switch to the back end and do all of my models and then do all of my endpoints, that's a fine way of doing it, right? I kind of like breaking it up into segments just so we can get those wins. We can say, look, the customer's page is fully done. Look, the appliance page is now fully done. And that's something we can share with a client, right? When we go to a client, we go, oh, all of our database models are created. They're like, and what does that mean to me, right? So breaking it up into those chunks can be beneficial, but really depends on what your timeline is. You know, if you need to cut corners, how your brain works. It used to be the back end was never written in JavaScript. So you would be writing out all your HTML and JavaScript on the front end, and then literally have to switch to a different language on the back end. Something like Python doesn't use semicolons at the end of lines. And you would be shocked at when you are typing and you've got your muscle memory going and you're adding semicolons at the end of JavaScript, and you go over to your Python, you're adding in semicolons, and your Python's yelling at you bloody murder because it doesn't know what a semicolon is at the end of the line. So there's definitely that language switching that happens sometimes on the back end. We've just been a little bit more fortunate because our back end is in JavaScript, so you get less of that switch going on. And that's even something that we brag about in our job description, which Laura sent, I believe, last night and maybe even before that. But that is an actual 2Zeg job description we use. I made a couple modifications to it before I shared it with Laura to share with you guys. But that is a very close job description to what we actually use to hire for junior devs.
Thank you, Max. Very helpful.
You being here on a Saturday morning, I know you guys are all prepared for long-winded answers.
Hey, Max, I'll jump in. This is Latonia. I wanted to ask if you could just do an overview again on the deploy process, just because I know you and just talk about the fact that we can deploy at various stages and just go from here.
Yeah, so deploying, the process of getting your code out on the internet and published and accessible to users. There are, so the module, not next week, but I believe the following week is all around DevOps and servers and infrastructure and deploying and all of that stuff. So I'm not sure what Nathan has decided yet on what cloud he's going to use, whether it's going to be AWS or oh, I'm blanking on DigitalOcean is another one. DigitalOcean is kind of a hybrid between traditional web hosting and the full-blown cloud, which is AWS or Google Cloud or Azure. DigitalOcean is more developer focused, a little bit more friendly, but also a lot more extensible than web hosting, traditional web hosting is. So I'm not sure if he's going to cover DigitalOcean or AWS or a little bit of both. But basically right now we haven't covered a way for you to deploy your databases or your servers out onto the internet, right? We've run all of our servers locally, but we haven't gone through that step of how do we actually hit a shiny big red button that sends it out to the world so the world can access it. With that said, what we have covered is GitHub Pages, and GitHub Pages will allow you to deploy static code. And when we say static code, we mean code that is not using a backend, code that is not going to change on its own, code that once you send it, the whole website works without any server interaction happening. You can deploy static code that uses a different API, an API other than your own, and of course, make your website use that, like the New York Times project. But GitHub Pages does not support back-end deploys, and your back-end deploy tends to involve both the database and your API server. So you will be learning how to deploy them, not this upcoming week, but I believe it's the following week. And if not, it's one of the 3 modules after module 7/8. So it is definitely coming up. With all of that said, you should be able to deploy to GitHub Pages. If you go all the way back to, I think we did it in module 1, we bought your domains, wired up the DNS, and got that working on GitHub Pages. You can use that same technique to deploy any of your code. With that said, if you want to deploy your React code, it gets a little trickier with GitHub Pages because you need to build your React code, which is the process of transforming your JSX that you're writing into regular JavaScript that any web browser can run. And so if you just do a search for GitHub Pages React, there is a very popular NPM package for deploying your React projects to GitHub Pages. It is a couple steps, but that should, I know Latonia, you've gone through that. I think I helped Dominique through it, and there may have been one other student. So it's about 10 steps you have to follow, but it is possible to publish your React projects to GitHub Pages without having to pay for any hosting, which is a great option. And if you have any questions on that, that is a perfectly legitimate use of one-on-one time. So I am booked out until next Saturday. I'm taking some time off from one-on-ones after today. But if you would like help getting your React projects or even a static HTML project deployed to GitHub Pages, I can definitely help with that during one-on-ones. Is there any questions in there, Latonia, that I didn't cover? Latonia, anything I didn't cover in deploy that you had questions about? I think your internet's in and out.
Hey, Max, I don't know if you were talking to me, but my internet was out. It froze up. I'm sorry. I just wanted to toss in, you did say that we don't have to worry about edits. We can deploy and still make edits and stuff, right? Okay.
Yes, the deploy process is often iterative. So you never deploy and then go, that's it. I can never touch that code again. You can always redeploy your code, which is a common thing to do. And for the capstone, it is not a requirement that you have it deployed. Obviously, it's a cool thing. It's a little bonus if you have it deployed, because that means you can send other people to it and they can test it. But it is not a requirement to deploy. You can just plug in your laptop and during the graduation ceremony, the presentations, just show what's running locally. right? It's not the end of the world if your code is not deployed. And that is it has become so complex to deploy now with the cloud that DevOps is an entirely different job title. And so it is possible to just specialize in DevOps and just know a little bit about code, but specializing in deploying and scaling and managing servers and databases and making sure that you can get the code from the developers and build it and bring it over to the server, integrating testing, which is a module coming up as well. So lots of different stuff in there. Dominique, you mentioned Npm Run Deploy. That is what we set up. It isn't like you can just run that out of the box and like it will magically show up on your GitHub pages. But that React GitHub pages NPM project I mentioned will walk you through those steps so that when you do want to deploy, it is simple as running Npm Run Deploy, and within 2 or 3 minutes, that page is up on the internet and accessible.
Kind of related to deploying. So if you're using React, does that kind of automatically hide your API keys? Or
No.
there are some tricks you have to learn to do that?
That is a great question. Yeah, there are some APIs that are developed where your API key can be public. So I'm not sure if the New York Times is a good example of that, but there are times that you actually want to expose an API key. So you can say it is okay to publish that on the front end. With that said, that is few and far between. So normally, ideally, if you wanted to keep your API key private, what you would actually do is set up your own API on your own backend, make the call to the New York Times from your backend where the API key is private because you're running it on your own server. And then you would relay that information that you got from the New York Times through your backend to the front end. So the most common way of hiding an API key is using that API key on the server instead of using it in your front end. The most common example I can think of for that is sending an email. There are services, APIs that you can use to send an email from your server, to any email address. But you don't want to put that code on your front end, because if you put it on the front end, now people can go use your API key to send spam emails from your email address. And oh, by the way, you pay per email that you send. It's only a cent per like 1,000 emails, so it's pretty cheap. But all of a sudden, a spammer can get that and send 2 million emails from your account, and now you get this massive bill. So API keys, great question, Kyle. Thank you for asking. You do want to be careful about using them on the front end, especially if you're paying for them, because you don't want to expose your API key. So it makes a lot of sense to put that in your server-side code instead of your front-end code. And that is a major concern, not only with deploying your code for the first time if it has an API key in it, but also publishing it to GitHub. Because when you publish it to a public repo in GitHub, your API key is just as accessible as if you published it and could access that code directly. So you do want to be careful with whatever's going into a public repo, that you do not have an API key or anything that you can consider secret. And GitHub has actually built some features in the past year or two to basically say, hey, heads up, we found an API key. We are aware of what that API key is for. If it's for AWS or for an email API or anything you pay for, they give you a little warning of like, hey, you should probably remove this, and here are the instructions to do that. Because once things go in Git, they are very hard to remove from Git, right? Just because you delete it and commit it and push it does not mean that it is gone from your repo. Git tracks every individual commit that you do, and you can actually go into your history of commits and see the evolution of that file across all of the commits. And if you have a commit that says delete API key, maybe I could go into your previous commits, do a search for API key, find where that was, and find where you put your API key in. So better to disable the API key remove it from your repository, and then generate a new one, and make sure that you don't publish that new one, which is a thing you can do on most services. Once you get an API key, there is a way to ask for another one and deactivate the old one. So you do want to be careful. New York Times API key, not the end of the world. They don't have your credit card. If that API key gets locked out or someone steals it, big whoop, right? Like I'm not going to get charged for anything. I'm not going to get banned from the New York Times, nothing like that. But you do definitely need to be careful. And that's something that I'm sure Nathan will touch on a little bit. But if not, feel free to ask about, like, how do I keep production secrets secret like an API key? Which is a great question for the upcoming module.
Thanks. I've actually been wondering about that for quite a while. So I've also been removing my API key before I commit my code every time, but I'm afraid I might not remember to do that at some point. Are there any tricks for how to handle that?
Sure are.
Now?
So what you can do is you can put your API key in a separate file called like secrets.js, and module.export out that string and import it in whatever code you're using that API key for, and then use your .gitignore file to ignore secrets.js.
Thank you. That sounds like a good idea.
There are other ways of doing it for sure. And there are some cloud services that will actually let you put secrets right in the configuration of the server. But a very common way of doing it is putting it in a separate file, ignoring that file, and then just exporting it out from that secrets file and importing it as a variable, my API key, into wherever you make the fetch call or the Axios call or whatever it is.
Right. Or even I could probably just do a longer file path and keep it in my documents folder, which I'm not committing, right? That would probably be safer in case I mess up the gitignore.
That's another approach you can definitely do. If you do the gitignore and commit the gitignore, when you are committing the updates, you'll see that like the file doesn't even show up to hit the little plus button to add it to the commit. So you should be pretty safe in doing it in a gitignore, especially if you gitignore like secrets.js. But
I would gitignore it before I put the API key there or something.
Yes.
Yeah, and test. Yep.
You got it. Yeah, as long as secrets.js is not showing up in the VS Code version control tab, you'll know you did your gitignore right. But you do want to commit your gitignore before you do anything on secrets.js. Or whatever you call it. You could call it API key or whatever, doesn't matter. But that is a very common thing and happens all the time. And people get a $20,000 AWS bill and they're sobbing to Amazon because they accidentally published their API key, and people went, oh, free servers, and took the API key and charged, spun up all of this stuff that just got charged their credit to someone else's credit card. So definitely something to watch out for. Karen threw some schedule information into the chat of what's coming up next. Reminder, you should all have access to the public schedule, if not through Google Classroom. If you just do a search for public schedule in your Google Drive, it should pop up. And that has not only all of the instructor information in it, but also the week numbers and the modules and what they're covering. That may not seem particularly useful now, but when you get into your jobs, which I'm confident all of you guys are going to get, and you go, oh, I learned that in Careers in Code. I would like to go back to the video and find the video where we covered all of that. You go, oh, crap. I don't remember if that was in June or July. When did Max ramble on about that? And so that schedule is super helpful in pinpointing the dates. And once you've got the dates pinpointed, obviously, it's much easier to find that video over in YouTube. We did a much better job of labeling the videos in YouTube this cohort than last. But with that said, there are still, well over 100 videos, right? And so even when you've got it limited down to the module, it's like, oh crap, we did 2 weeks of the database and I'm looking for that one day, you know, we started working with SQLize. What day was that? And so that public schedule Google Sheet should be super helpful. If you can't find it, let me know and I can grab the link for you guys. Carolyn, you said parsing. Was that a question of what parsing is? No, okay. In that case, I'm out of questions.
I'm kind of curious about next week. I feel like all we've really done so far is just get things like basically set up. So I feel like, I don't know, I'm just wondering what else there might be in the back end. Obviously search. But yeah, I don't know. This may be just kind of a preview of what we're already going to cover, but yeah, I feel like I haven't had nearly enough exposure to the back end and we're getting toward the end of it already. So
yeah, no, the back end is there's less to cover in it than you think. And because you already have such good exposure to JavaScript in the front end, the back end becomes much easier to learn because you don't have to learn all the new syntax and you don't have to start from scratch, right? So the basic fundamentals of the back end we've already covered. Let's talk about different endpoints and different HTTP methods. Let's talk about the different ways of sending information from the front end to the back end, whether it's the query or a route parameter. Let's talk about routes themselves and you know how that routing works. What we haven't, cores is another one, and parsing that information coming in and out. What we haven't covered is middleware extensively. So middleware is, hey, how do we get this section of my code running before my endpoint actually runs? How can we basically string along a bunch of functions that run before my endpoint does? And the biggest example of that will be around user authentication of how do we store a password in the database and make sure the user is logged in before we actually return some information. So I am going to find a basic way of covering that, which is super insecure, but also super easy, right? Of, okay, how do we send an unencrypted password and validate that password before we move along? Which is a terrible idea. And I will be saying that over and over again as we do it, is do not do this, do not do this. But it will show you the setup of how we use the middleware, how we validate all of that on the back end. And then in the upcoming modules, you will cover hashing, which is the way to securely store a password, how to build out that authentication system, all of that kind of stuff more securely. You may cover JSON web tokens, which is another more modern approach to authentication without having to worry about storing the user password in a place that the user password could get stolen, like the front end. Body parser is a middleware, so is cores. We know they are middlewares because we say app.use, and we are using them as server-wide middle,ware, which means they run on every single endpoint that we do app.use or server.use, whatever we named it. The .use command is telling Express, use this middleware that I'm giving you access to on every single endpoint. We will do an example of middleware that isn't on every single endpoint and just on a couple of them, because you run into this problem with authentication of, oh, I don't want to authenticate every endpoint because they need to be able to log in. So we can't say if they're not logged in, don't let them log in, right? Like we can't block access to every endpoint and say, make sure every user is logged in, because they need the ability to log in before they hit our login endpoint. That may make no sense. It will make more sense in the upcoming week. So we will touch on login. That will probably be closer to the end of the week. And we will touch on a little bit of middleware. But if you look at Express concepts, there are like 5 or 10 that we've already covered that are super easy to learn. And then there's this huge gap, and then these super advanced concepts of like how to scale your server and how to get super complicated. So for the most part, believe it or not, we've actually covered a lot of the back end, and especially the parts of the back end that you would need to build a full stack app. Carolyn, it's not if. When you build, the question is when you build your JSX code to get it into JavaScript, is that considered parsing? And it kind of is. It's closer to transpiling, which I think Caitlin covered back with you all the way when we were talking about Sass, of how can I write this more advanced CSS code, but also have the browser still be able to understand it. And so that is the process of transpiling, when you take code in one language and convert it to a different language. So what React does is it transpiles your JSX code into JS. It is, I think you can argue part of the transpiling process is parsing, because parsing is taking unstructured data and parsing it into something that is structured. Our biggest example of parsing is we get JSON, but it comes in as a string, and we want that to be an object. And so we parse our string, which looks like JSON to us, but is still a string, and we parse that into an object that we can use in JavaScript. So important to remember that JSON and a JavaScript object are not synonymous. JSON does stand for JavaScript object notation, but JavaScript object notation is always a string. We have to parse that JSON into our object before we can use it. And so stringify is the opposite, when we take our object and turn it into the string. And that's the two-way process, right? We parse a string into an object, and then we can stringify an object back into a string. We've kind of played it a little fast and loose with JSON. On when we use fetch, we definitely had to say, response.json, which is what took our response and made it into our object for us. But if you notice in our Express code, when we send back an object, we send back an actual object. We don't call stringify. That's because Express is doing that for us under the hood. And we do the opposite when the data comes in. It's actually coming in as a string. And then we use our body parser to convert that string into the JavaScript object for us.
I was getting JSX and JSON in my brain. I'm not awake yet. But thank you. That does help. And I hope the question wasn't a pain. All right.
No. And transpilers are an advanced level of computer science voodoo for me. I've never written a transpiler myself. I understand the concepts of it, but it's also like, you can create your own programming language, but why would you do it? There are already thousands of them out there, and there are probably 10 that I can name off the top of my head that are used by, millions of users a day, and have a great community behind them. And so it's like, unless you're Google, where you need to figure out how to search through trillions of rows in a database and return results in a couple milliseconds, chances are you probably don't need to create your own programming language. But that is still a topic that is taught in traditional computer science 4-year bachelor degrees. Is let's talk about building a compiler. Let's build one from scratch. Let's cover those concepts. So I will wait to see if there are any other questions, but I can do a 5-minute diatribe on the difference between an engineer and a developer, but would rather answer any questions you guys have before I launch into that whole spiel.
I had 2 quick things. I was just curious if we could incorporate a fetch into the endpoints we were working in our server.js. You can? Okay. And then the other thing is, when we were in class, someone brought up that list we had done earlier on, and you said something about if there were crickets, you were going to revisit it. I can't remember exactly what the question was, but do you know what I'm talking about? Somebody asked you to Kyle shook her head. You know what I'm talking about, Kyle?
I was
Somebody-
just gonna ask the same thing, yes.
What was it? What did I promise to do?
The list of all the different, that we brainstormed like the
Items.
first week about
Yes,
all the
yes.
different libraries.
Susan asked
and
me about that.
languages and- yeah.
Yeah, we can revisit that for sure. Latonia, for your first question, you can definitely do fetch in the back end. However, fetch is built into the browser. It isn't built into Node itself. So there is a package called node.fetch that if you install Node Fetch and require it, fetch will work just like it does in the browser. The whole point of that project was to bring fetch, which is built into Chrome and Firefox and all of those, over to Node so that you could use the same exact syntax and options and parameters and all of that stuff over in Node. It is the one that I reach for because I don't think I've ever created an API that didn't need to call another API or talk to another server. So node-fetch is the thing that I definitely use because it is so similar to what we use in the browser, which is built in. But there are other popular ones out there. Axios works in both the front end and the back end. So if you liked Axios more, you can definitely use Axios. I've got nothing against that. All of these have well over 1 million weekly downloads. So you know people are using them. There was an older one called Request, and I feel like that may have been depreciated. I used to use Request. I've been moving all of our code over to using Node Fetch. But lots of good options out there. If they've got more than a weekly download, feel free to use any of them. At the end of the day, all you're doing is making a request, pulling some JSON out of it, and using that data. So Node Fetch is my go-to, but that's not to say the other options out there are bad. If you told me tomorrow that I had to stop using Node Fetch, I'd say, okay, wouldn't shed a tear and would switch over to Axios. You know, it's not like I've got a strong opinion on any of them, which may be the only topic I've ever offered competitors up and said that I don't have a strong opinion on them. Very, very common thing as a developer to have an opinion on everything.
Can I have a quick piggyback question?
Yeah.
When we're doing this, do you recommend those randomuser.com or there's different sites where you can kind of just get free data to test your stuff, or should we be doing some other method for this?
No, that's fine. The Star Wars API is a common one to test with and get data out of and practice, burying into an object or into an array to get out specific information you're looking for. But New York Times API is a good one. It does require an API key, but that's a good one to test with. Any of those test APIs, I don't have a strong opinion on any of them. They're all good to test with. Okay, let me see if I can find way back in the good old days of module 1, if I can find that list.
Yeah, I have a copy in my Google Drive too, so I don't know if I could screen share it if it's easier for you, faster. Whatever. I mean, I know you know where you're going.
Give
It was
me a
in
second.
Google Drive resources, I think. Classroom resources.
I'm accessing it right through Google Drive, but I'm wondering if it will be quicker for me to get to it through the classroom.
Yeah, I have a bookmark too. I could just.
Got it.
Okay, very good. Thanks. Just trying to be helpful. I'm not trying to do your job for you.
Though for some reason, Chrome would not like to show up. Oh, there it is. Was not showing up in my screen share. It's like, where did you go? And I think I gave you guys edit access to this as well. Let me see. Maybe I didn't. Yes, I did. So you guys should have access to editing this document as well. So what we did in this list is we went through, we've got a lot at the bottom that we didn't get to. Bad Max, I promised I would come back and update this. What we did is we started labeling it with different categories, right? So to review, Sometimes we talk about a tool as in something we would use to write code, or more of like something you would install, not necessarily the code itself. We then started breaking it down into different categories, right? So either if it's a framework, we labeled it what the framework is used for and what language it is written in. So WordPress is a framework. So if we start thinking about the frameworks, we have now used React, which they argue is a library, but I hate that. They are a framework, in my opinion. And the framework is just, all right, it's not a language on its own. It's just tools that they give us that make it easier for us to build our code on top of. And then we labeled it as PHP. WordPress also uses, now we can update this, WordPress also uses MySQL under the hood, because all of that content that you're storing in WordPress has to be stored somewhere. And so they store it all in MySQL. So what actually happens when you load a WordPress page is it starts loading the page and it hits this PHP and it goes, oh, this is some server-side code. Let me go run this over on the server. And the server-side code goes, oh, you would like me to go get my content. I'm going to go to my SQL server. I'm going to pull out the content from the database. I'm going to process that in my server-side PHP code, and I'm going to spit it out onto my HTML. And so that's how WordPress works under the hood. Is it's literally just a framework running an API that is able to access your database and get content out into it. So with that said, I will actually spend time to update anything else on this list. I can actually rapid fire. I can rapid fire down this list unless anyone has things they'd like to add to the end of it or specific ones they want me to cover.
Yeah, Max, I'm the one that added IDXL. It's something that my husband uses at his job, but you'll be hard put to find much about it because it was kind of written by one of his colleagues and a former employee, and it's kind of obscure, but I thought it would be fun if people wanted to find out what it is.
Yeah, I'm actually going to label some of these. Obscure is probably a good word for it,
And
because
rather like 40 years old.
yeah, and
As is the
I will
infrastructure.
actually potentially label it legacy.
Yeah.
And there are some things in here that you can argue I'm being aggressive with my legacy labeling, like for XML, for example. It's very uncommon to see people writing XML code anymore. XML was by far the dominant standard before JSON. And so when we started thinking about, oh, what's a data format that's flexible so that I can put my own structure into it, but at the same time is readable by other programming languages, XML for a long time was the go-to. In fact, Word documents and Excel documents and all of those are still stored in XML. So I hesitate to label it as legacy because it is still used. But JSON, for the most part, has replaced it. So I'm gonna say largely replaced.
So like a Word document, the file extension docx, that's the XML.
Yes.
Because we used to use it all the time, but again, that was a long time ago. Oh, I never thought about that. Thank you.
Yep. And you can actually pop open a Word document in VS Code and take a look at the XML in the Word document. Which is a fun thing to do. If you just file open in VS Code and open up a Word document, you can actually see the XML file, the .docx has subfolders inside of it that are hidden that you would never think would be there, that are storing things like images and other things that you drag into the document. And then there is a .xml file that you can pop open and has all of the XML exposed.
I have a question. Can we go back up to Node.js on that list?
Yep.
It just says framework to me, because I was looking at this earlier. That doesn't really give me like a clear idea of what Node.js does. I'm wondering if runtime is like a subcategory of framework, and Are there other run times, or I don't know. I think that's the word I'm looking for based on looking at like their documentation or whatever.
Yeah. I will go through .NET and get back to your question, Latonia. I don't. You're right. Framework is not the right label for it. It is closer to a language than it is a framework, but I will add runtime. The basic idea, I mean, when you say Node.js, 99% of people, if you said what is Node.js, they would say it is a server, right? Or it is used for a server. But what it actually is JavaScript is kind of weird that there is no standard runtime for JavaScript, right? So when you talk about Python, there's only one Python runtime, as far as I know. When you talk about Ruby, there's only one Ruby runtime, right? It's like go ahead.
I don't really, I guess, I mean, when I was teaching myself Python, I was using a program where you just hit run. You didn't have to type node or whatever.
Yes, and there are other, you can set up VS Code actually to run your JavaScript code by just clicking a run button. But there are all of those other programming languages, as far as I know, there's one runtime, which means it's literally the code that is responsible for taking your code and translating it into computer code that the computer then knows how to execute. That is the runtime engine, right? Like literally what happens when we type in node and the script name or the file name, or when we hit the run button, or when we go to the browser. And so that's what's kind of unique about JavaScript and what makes it harder to label Node.js is that each browser has their own JavaScript runtime engine, and they're all called different things. And some of them gets even more complicated because it intermixes the DOM link into them as well of how does this JavaScript interact with the HTML that I've already rendered out onto this page. So that's why it's hard because yes, Node.js is a runtime. And what makes it so unique is that they took this language that had lots of different runtimes in the browser, depending on what browser you were using, and made a runtime for JavaScript that was designed to make your code run on the server. And so that is, out of all the things on this list, that is probably the hardest one to label, and one that I could probably go to column Z of sticking different labels on it and being like, well, yes, it's a runtime. Yes, it's used for the server. Yes, it's written in JavaScript, but it's also written in C++ because that's how the runtime works. And it's also kind of a language because there are certain things that we can't use in Node that we can use in the browser, like the DOM, but there are also packages that you can require into it. And there's also a whole package system behind it, which is what NPM is. It is like, there are so many different ways of labeling Node that I can't put like one definitive answer on it. Going in the order of questions, do you know what the first SAS stands for, Latonia? SAA.
I don't, because isn't it short than S? I didn't know if it was.
It is. So
okay.
SASS is a form of CSS. SAS is semantic styling CS. I forget what it stands for, or it may not stand for anything. But SASS is a type of CSS that you can transpile back into regular CSS, but it gives you access to more features like using variables in your CSS. So you could make a variable called blue and define it as a certain hex code, and then use your blue variable anywhere, and it would just default to using that variable. It also has the benefit that you can change your blue in literally one line of code, and every place you use blue across your entire website will update to that new version of blue. So there are other features in SAS, like the ability to use curly braces. So you can say target this parent element, and then anything inside that parent element's curly braces will only be targeted for this stuff in there. So we can actually use Sass, if not natively with React, very much easier to use in React than it is in a standalone HTML project, because normally in a standalone HTML project, we would have to run a server, kind of like NodeMon, that would be transpiling our ASS files into our CSS files, and we would have to go through a build process. But because Webpack is built into Create React App, we can actually configure our files to use Sass much easier than we can if we were doing it on a standalone thing. SaaS stands for Software as a Service, and that is the notion of any cloud service that you use, right? So I pay for office.com, and I can use office.com and access my software, and you're running it for me. You have it on your own servers. I'm paying you. I don't have to worry about servers or managing it. So instead of me saying, I'm going to buy $100 version of Office and run it on my computer, I can say, I'm going to pay you $5 a month or whatever the pricing is. And you are not only going to provide me the software, but you're going to provide it to me as a service. So you're going to manage running it on the cloud for me and all of that stuff. .NET is a framework that is very popular, very, very, very popular in the Syracuse area, the greater Syracuse area. It is a framework made by Microsoft, and it basically combines Node.js, Express, and Sequelize all into one thing. It is largely written in a language called C#, which is a derivative of either C or C++. I'm not sure which one. But if you wanted to, you could have, if you looked at your stack, you could pick React or Angular and still use those with .NET. But then .NET is kind of this wide covering thing that takes care of your object relational mapper. It takes care of your database connections. It takes care of the server itself, and it takes care of the router and everything that Express gives you. So .NET is a very popular framework. There are free versions of it. One of them is ASP.core, I think. I am not a .NET expert, so take all of this with a grain of salt. For a long, long time, the main detractor of .NET was that it had to run on a Windows server. And if it was running on a Windows server, it meant that you had to pay for a license to run Windows, which was not really a big deal back in the good olden days of Microsoft, where every server you had was sitting in a closet in the office, right? But when we got to scaling, all of a sudden that became a problem because horizontal scaling became more popular, right? Instead of just throwing more resources into one server and making it a giant one, it became a lot easier to scale vertically and say, I would just like to have multiple servers running now. Well, that presented some licensing issues with Windows, because Windows was like, well, you need to have a license for every server that's running. But what happens if I spin up that server for a high demand usage, use it for an hour or two, and then go, oh, I don't have as many users on my site anymore. I'm going to get rid of that server. But I paid for that Windows license. So there were all kinds of headaches that came out of .NET maybe 10-ish years ago, because they did require a Windows Server operating system license to run .NET. A lot of those concerns have been eased now, and Microsoft has kind of been opening it up to the open source community. But there are still parts of .NET that are licensed by Microsoft, and when we say license, we mean you have to pay for it. It is a fine framework to learn, and definitely an option if you are getting out of the boot camp and saying, I would like to expand my experience and be more attractive to employers. .NET is definitely a topic to consider taking like a Udemy course on, or finding some other course and going through that. All the concepts that you are learning in the back end will translate to .NET. They may call it slightly different things, though. I'm going to try and burn through these questions quickly because I've got a one-on-one right after this. Angular, React, they are our front-end frameworks. They are the two dominant front-end frameworks in the market right now. I'm not quite sure what their market share is. Angular is made by Google. React is made by Facebook. But they have large open source communities now. So there are people at other companies now working on those projects that are used across sites all over the place. Vue is the third major one, Vue. It is gaining market share. It is more popular because it has a smaller learning curve. In terms of hardness to learn, React is probably right in the middle. Vue is a little easier to learn than React, and Angular is a little harder to learn than React, at least in my own personal experience. I know at least 5 developers that I could name off the top of my head that could scream my head off and say Angular is so much easier to learn than React. I don't agree with them, but they are 3 good modern frameworks that are built around this notion of we are building web apps, not websites anymore. We need the ability to make them more interactive, and that is where those 3 excel. In the olden days, everyone used jQuery because there were certain features that were not built into JavaScript that jQuery just made 10 times easier to load. So back in the day, when you started up a new website, jQuery was the first thing you dropped in because you wouldn't dare to write any JavaScript that wasn't using jQuery. So those are the popular ones. There are a lot less front-end frameworks than there are back-end frameworks, which is why we can name 5 back-end languages or languages that are used in the back-end off the top of my head: PHP, Python, JavaScript, Ruby, C# for .NET. 5 right there. And I'm sure I'm missing, but those are the major back-end languages. But fewer front-end frameworks because the frameworks have to be written in JavaScript. JavaScript is the only language that works across all 3 browsers except HTML and CSS. You can technically argue WebAssembly and C++, but that is a very advanced technical rabbit hole that I just barely went down and went, nope, this is too computer sciencey for me. I'm a developer, not an engineer. I'm not going to dig into this. But there are now ways of running more advanced computational code in the browser. It is called WebAssembly. You write it in C++. It is not something that I recommend you go down, but is something that I should probably mention. Bootstrap is an HTML framework. Bootstrap can be laid into any 3 of those front-end frameworks or JavaScript frameworks. React, Angular, and Vue all support Bootstrap, but Bootstrap is a HTML framework. React, Vue, and Angular are a JavaScript framework. No such thing as too many style sheets. What you do want to make sure is that your build process is unifying them down into one giant style sheet. But that does depend on what framework you're using. So if you're just doing vanilla HTML and JavaScript and CSS and not using something like React, I would say you want to only have 2 or 3 CSS files, maybe 1 for Bootstrap itself, pulling in that library, 1 that may be called global.css that is applied to all of your pages, and then a 3rd one called, whatever the page name is, .css. I would be hesitant to include any more than 3. You can break that rule if you're using React, which in the build process unifies all of your CSS down into 1 file anyway for you. But that's just a quick rule of thumb. I'm already 5 minutes late for a one-on-one. So I think that's everything I can cover. I will update the spreadsheet and label some things in there. If you guys want to leave comments on specific things in that spreadsheet, I will reply to those comments as well. Cool. See you guys.